Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. Today, we're going to look at this particular passage. Take pity on orphans and be sympathetic to widows. Respect the old and care for the young. Now, this particular passage draws our attention to some of the most vulnerable members of the community, the orphans and widows. At the same time, it also highlights the periods in a person's lifetime where they may be more vulnerable than other times, when they're old and as a young child, childhood and old age. So if we take the first sentence first, take pity on orphans and be sympathetic to widows. What do we mean by, does the Exalted Treatise mean by this particular sentence? Well, firstly, orphans. Most people, when they come across the term orphan, they'll automatically think of a young child who has whose father and mother has passed away. And they would be completely correct. Now, in the 12th century China, when the Exalted Treatise was written, the term orphan also extended to include, the children who had lost either their father or their mother through death. So it actually refers to a young child whose parent, either one parent or both parents, have passed away. As for widows, a widow is a married woman whose husband has passed away and who has not remarried. Now, widows and orphans, this particular sentence really highlights, as I said before, some of the most vulnerable members within our community. And it's interesting because that is not only true in today's times in the modern world, but very much so as early as the legendary antiquity, this early period in China's long history. And I say this because in the venerated documents, what's known in Chinese as the Shangshu, in its records about the legendary Emperor Shun, there's a reference to traditionally 4 categories of vulnerable members of the community. Orphans and widows are just 2 of them. The other 2 being the widowers, so that is a widower being a married man who is whose wife has passed away and who has not remarried, and also the elderly who are childless or otherwise lack children to care for them in their old age. So these 4 groups were highlighted in the past as being, particularly vulnerable members of our community and all the more deserving of our special care and attention. Now, that's, I think, not just true in terms of Chinese society throughout time, but also right across, human communities right around the world. Orphans and widows, widowers, and certainly, the elderly without immediate family to look after them. Now, the sentence highlights the plight of orphans and widows, and really, if you think about it, being orphaned or widowed means a person finds themselves suddenly very much alone and without the support of their immediate family. And as a result, they might have to come to depend on their family relatives, extended family members, or the charity of friends, or even strangers. So it's probably no wonder that the Exalted Treatise here is encouraging us to think of the orphans and the widows. If a person wants to help others beyond their family. Now that we're clear about who the orphans and widows are, what can we do to help? What does it mean to take pity on orphans? Well, if you think about it, an orphan is a person, young child, has lost one or both their parents. Now, parents are generally a child's primary caregivers in most instances. So essentially, this is a young child, young person unable to look after themselves, especially if they're very, very young. And what they would need is a stable and safe home environment, aside from shelter, a roof over their heads, the fundamental basics of food and clothing, but someone to care for them, to look after them. And on top of that, to be able to receive some sort of education so that they can learn to read and write, some skills to be able to contribute to the community when they grow up, and ultimately to be able to support themselves. So these are some of the key needs of an orphan. So how can we help? Well, taking pity on orphans, showing compassion to orphans might look like this. It might mean helping to find someone or a family who is willing and able to adopt or foster an orphan child. It might mean assisting in establishing an orphanage to help many children in the same situation. I mentioned about education before. It might mean contributing towards the paying of school fees or providing scholarships so that such children don't miss out on an education. These are some of the ways that we could do something in helping out these particular vulnerable members of society. And what about the widows? Widow being a married woman whose husband has passed away. This might be due to illness or accident or wartime conditions. In 12th century China, when the Exalted Treatise was written, a widow, a woman would look to her husband to be the breadwinner, to be the primary source of financial support. So a widow is suddenly without this support. And, on top of that, in 12th century China, there was very limited opportunity for a woman to work. On top of that, there would often be the question of looking after young children if she had any children. So you can understand that as a result, a widow would come to rely and depend on her in-laws, her late husband's parents, or his brothers if he had any brothers. Sometimes she would have to rely on her own relatives, and even the charity or kindness of friends and strangers. Now, because providing support to a widow and any children that she might have, this was an ongoing financial burden for her in-laws. So sometimes some in-laws might arrange for a widow to be remarried, whether she wanted to or not. Now, the Exalted Treatise alerts us to be sympathetic to widows, to be understanding, to respect their choice of, not remarrying. And I suppose as a fundamental element is really ensuring that they are supported if they choose not to remarry, to be able to have a stable home environment, to be able to look after their children if they have any children. So that gives us a rough general idea of what it might mean to take pity on orphans and to be sympathetic to widows. Now, and providing for these two groups as a matter of priority. Now, having heard about this, some people might think, well, to be able to help these, vulnerable members of the community probably requires my being financially very well off. I'd like to share with you 5 historical accounts, different people from different points in time throughout China's long history that might shed a different light on this particular question. Now, the first historical account is about a young orphan by the name of Yang Bo, and he lived in what's known as the latter Han dynasty in the late 1st century. Now, Yang Bo, his mother passed away when he was a young child, and his father remarried, so he ended up having a stepmother and also a stepbrother as well when his stepmother had a son of her own. Unfortunately, his stepmother disliked him, Yang Bo, and treated him rather badly. So much so that his stepbrother was really very concerned about this ongoing rift in the family. And it's recorded that, by the time that his younger stepbrother, by the name of Yang Ho, by the time that he was about 9 years old, so this was an ongoing concern, and presumably would have tried different ways to try to persuade his stepmother to, treat his older stepbrother a bit better, but in vain. It comes to a point where the Yang Ho, the younger stepbrother here, he pretends to be ill, and he takes to his bed and refuses to eat. And well, the long and short of it is that this really moves his mother to change. And it's recorded that from this time on, the stepmother loves and cares for Yang Bo as much as she does for Yang Ho. So this short account illustrates the love of a younger stepbrother for his older stepbrother. And he's only 9 years old to fix this ongoing rift in the family. Well, there's also another really remarkable story, and it does relate to stepbrothers, incidentally. And this comes from around about 15th century China, in what's known as Ming Dynasty China. It relates to a merchant who lived in the capital city of Hangzhou province. And around this particular time, the city suffers from a great fire. And the flames devastate, ravage everything throughout the city, destroys all the buildings and houses, all of them, except for one house. And it was a house that belonged to a merchant. Now, everyone, all the locals, they were convinced that this was a miracle, and this must have been because the merchant has cultivated great merits to protect his house from this terrible fire. The merchant, being the humble man that he was, denied that he had done any particular great deed. But later on, his uncle visits the area, and the locals ask his uncle, who's able to, share a bit more about the background to this merchant. And it turns out that the merchant, which is nephew to the uncle, was an orphan once upon a time, and he had lost his mother as a young boy. His father remarried, so he had a stepmother and 4 younger stepbrothers. When their father passed away, the stepbrothers were roughly aged between 3 and 5, so very young. And this the merchant, he grew up to become a merchant. He took it upon himself. He was fairly young himself, but he took it upon himself to work and provide for the whole family, to shoulder this responsibility. And he essentially raised his younger stepbrothers, all 4 of them, and he cared for them until They were old enough to be married. Everyone was grown up, and he essentially divided the family property. By this time, it had saved up about 5,000 gold pieces, and he divided this sum equally between him and his 4 younger stepbrothers. They were so much younger than him, and you can imagine that if he ran off with the money, they would be none the wiser. He could have left them to fend for themselves. They were just his stepbrothers, right? But that was something that he didn't do, and he took responsibility. And of course, being brothers caring for each other, no one else really knew that much outside of the family. So it was a quiet marriage. And because of, they passed it, there was about some 20 years of really tough times. You can imagine, these 5 brothers, living on one income of a young, their oldest stepbrother. But they lived through 20 years of really tough times, and essentially this quiet merits. It's recorded in what's called the collected accounts of virtuous conduct. In Chinese, the 道德丛书. It's really interesting that this story crops up twice in this book, in the volume about family and in the volume about the community. There's a sort of a dedicated section on merchants. So it's a really remarkable account about how one, young boy, just like the boy in the previous story, the difference he makes in taking responsibility and helping out and raising his younger brothers and loving them equally, sharing whatever they had equally. So I thought that was definitely worth sharing. Now, what about the extended family and strangers that are mentioned? These 2 accounts just relate to the stepbrothers looking after each other. Now, there's another story, and it comes from late imperial China. It's a story of a young boy by the name of Huang Zhongyan, and he was an orphan. He was 4 years old when both his mother and father passed away. And he ended up being cared for, looked after by his father's older brother. So his uncle and his aunt. Unfortunately, they were very poor. They loved their nephew very much. They would, feed him whatever grain was in the house. While they themselves sort of got by on food scraps, basically the food of the poor. And Huang Zhongyan, he was extremely grateful to his uncle and aunt for everything that they did, in caring for him. And it's recorded that when he was about 6 years old, he actually said to his uncle, he expressed his wish to go to school, to be able to learn and study, so that he could make something of himself to repay them for their kindness in caring for him. It was very sincere, but unfortunately, his aunt and uncle were very poor, and they couldn't afford to send him to school, basically. Well, interestingly, around this time, the provincial governor responsible for this area, he has a dream one night, and in this dream, the spirit of a deity tells him about a young boy living within his jurisdiction. And this young boy would one day become the highest administrator, so a government official, a senior government official, responsible for the area that is now known as Beijing, the capital of China. And unfortunately, the young boy, his family is very poor, and he's unable to go to school. His sincerity, the sincerity of wishing to be educated, to go to school, was such that it has moved the heavens. And so this deity explains, where the boy can be located. On most days he can be found playing in the grounds of a particular temple, even climbing on the shoulders of the statue of this particular temple deity in this particular temple. And well, the governor, his surname was Cai, so Governor Cai. The next morning he wakes up and he goes to visit this particular temple. And sure enough, he recognizes the statue of this particular deity. And he could see, on the shoulders of the statue were sort of traces, marks, where, a young child might be, climbing about. And he talks to all the children playing in the grounds of the temple, and he discovers Huang Zhongyan, who comes from such a poor family that he's unable to go to school. Well, the Governor Cai, was very kind, and he contributes thereafter on a regular basis, a bushel of rice. So we can imagine maybe on a monthly basis, and pays for the tuition fees for a tutor to come and teach Huang Zhongyan. And this continues for some time, and about 3 years later, Governor Cai has to move away. It's probably posted to take up another position in another part of the country. And by this time, Huang Zhongyan is about 10 years old, and he's already learned to read and write. He's a very diligent student, and we're told that by the time that he's 18, so a few years later, he was put forward to take part in the civil service examinations. Now, these were examinations that one needed to pass to be able to have, be able to work as and serve as a government official, a very respectable career. And it's recorded that he later passed the highest level of the civil service examinations, what's known as the palace examinations. Meanwhile, by this time, Governor Cai is actually retired, and he's on his way back to his hometown. And he's traveling back to his hometown because in those days, working as a government official, you weren't allowed to serve in your hometown, to prevent bias and to ensure that, you're dealing with matters, your decisions would be as impartial as possible. So he's now retired and he's traveling back to his hometown, Governor Cai, and he makes a point of stopping to visit Huang Zhongyan, this, young orphan that he's supported all of these years. And he congratulates Huang Zhongyan on his examination success. And it's at this point that he relates the dream that he had all of these years ago. Huang Zhongyan is so grateful to him that he pays his respects to the governor as his own teacher. And later on, Huang Zhongyan actually becomes the highest administrator responsible for the area now known as Beijing. So it was incredible. By this time, his uncle had already passed away, and it's recorded that Huang Zhongyan loved and cared for his aunt as if he were her own son. So you can imagine, without the support and the care and the help of his uncle and aunt and Governor Cai, this young poor orphan would never have been able to realize his life potential. And, from their point of view, the positive difference you can make in the lives of, such vulnerable people, vulnerable members of the community. So this is one case where there's you could say a stranger, a non-relative involved. Well, what happens when there are no relatives involved at all? The next historical account relates to an anonymous fisherman. And there's no record of his name, and for good reason, as we'll find out in a minute. But he lived a very simple life. He would live on his boat, fish in the South China Sea, and basically he would go out fishing every day and exchange some of the fish for rice and wine, and eat his meals over an open fire. Very simple life. He wasn't particularly well off. But one time, that whole area was flooded, and the flood waters, overwhelmed all of the residents. Their homes and their property and belongings were swept away by the floodwaters. Lives were lost. And while some people took advantage of the situation to seize lost property and valuables, that were set adrift, this fisherman and his small fishing boat he would go around and try to rescue people. And he ended up saving 4 women and 3 children. And well, the women, they were all grown up and they could recognize, the remains of their homes. They could identify their relatives, etc. So it wasn't long before they were reunited with their families. For the young children, there were 3, things took a little bit longer. It sort of fell to the fishermen to make inquiries, ask around to find out if there were any parents or grandparents who had lost children matching the description of the 3 that he had saved. And so what the fisherman did was he entrusted these 3 children to the care of an old woman that he knew. And every day he would deliver all the rice that he had to ensure that they could be fed. And he himself sort of ate just 1 bowl of rice porridge, congee, each day. And he would ask around and research and try to find their homes. And it took some time. About over 1 month later, the floodwaters finally receded and he could reach more people. And when he sort of came across people who described children that matched the 3 that he saved, well, he would, point them to the location of where the old woman lived. And, sure enough, the 3 children were ultimately reunited with their families. You can imagine how overjoyed they were to know that the children were safe and sound after all this time. And when they tried to look for the fisherman to express their gratitude, they found that he had already moved on somewhere else. He obviously he was wanting to help, and he wasn't sort of thinking of being recognized or rewarded in any way. And so that's why, to this day, the record doesn't. It mentions fisherman, describes his sort of lifestyle, but sort of lacks a name. So again, not a very well-off person, but being able to save and rescue the lives, reunite families, and essentially, save these children from being orphans, or save the women from being widows. So I think more important than the financial resources is having the heart to care and a sense of resourcefulness in doing so. Now, you might be wondering, what about the widows? All these examples relate to orphans generally. What about the widows? Well, there's a remarkable historical account of a copyist, by the name of Pan Jiqing. And, you might be wondering what a copyist is. He was a copyist by trade. And in those times, the printing press wasn't generally available. And so people would have documents or letters or books copied out. And, not everyone knew how to read and write in those days. But it was just a very humble job. And we're told that he lived in a very sparse house, so he wasn't very well off. He lived with his elderly mother, his wife, and his son. His next door neighbors, he lived next to a widow. She was in her 60s, and she had a daughter who was only 17. And, she would do needlework, like embroidery, and weaving cloth to sell, to be sold, to support herself and her daughter. But unfortunately, very often her and her daughter would just not have enough food. And Pan Jiqing, he would always share whatever him and his family ate with the widow and her daughter next door. Essentially treated them as part of his own family, basically. Whenever he could afford fresh fruit and vegetables, he would always ensure that they would have some of that too. And so he lived next door to widow and her daughter. In the same village that they lived in, there was a boy by the name of Zuo Mao Yuan. And this poor boy, he became an orphan when both his parents passed away, and he was only 10 years old when they passed away. And Jiqing, being the kind man that he was, thought, what could he do to assist this orphan? And whenever he was home from work, he would always find time to teach Zuo Mao Yuan how to read and write. He even instructed him in the classics. These were sort of books that were compulsory learning as part of the classicist learning of pre-modern China, sort of formal education. And certainly it was a prerequisite for anyone who was considering becoming a government official. So he sort of taught this orphaned child for many years. Well, all of these good deeds probably brought about some amazing changes in his life. Pan Jiqing, he was a copyist by trade, but he became appointed as a government official. And this might have much to do with his being an upstanding character, being, such a kind and ethical person, contributing so much to the people around him in the community. So he ended up becoming a government official. We don't know his particular role, but we're told that his elderly mother passed away at the age of 99 without any illness, passed away very peacefully without any illness at all. And I think that is also no coincidence that she was able to enjoy this longevity, probably off the back of his good deeds, his quiet merits. Now, we're told that Zuo Mao Yuan, actually, on the day that his elderly mother passed away, the widow next door just so happens to also pass away. And Pan Jiqing arranges her funeral and her burial as he did for his own mother. So he sort of cared for his next door neighbors as if they were part of his own family. And after all the burial funeral was over, him and his family moved somewhere else. So where it's recorded that Zuo Mao Yuan, he goes on to become a presented scholar, passes, the highest level of examinations, and he becomes a high official. He actually constructs a pavilion to commemorate the kindness of Pan Jiqing. He never forgot what Pan Jiqing taught him, and in caring for him. And the locals within the community were so moved by Pan Jiqing's example that they recorded his biography as part of the local records. So we can see that, this ordinary person was so kind to the people around him, the widow next door, the orphan in the village, and was able to end up being appointed as a government official. His mother enjoyed longevity, and his contribution, what he did, his good name is remembered at the time by the local people, and to this very day. So he's, I suppose, just part of the positive outcomes from his kind conduct and good deeds. Okay, so that is in relation to taking pity on the orphans and being sympathetic to the widows. Well, the next part of the passage relates to respecting the old and caring for the young. Just share my PowerPoints again. So respecting the old and caring for the young. And as I mentioned before, this draws our attention to the most vulnerable periods of a person's lifetime. Obviously, not everyone will necessarily be orphaned and or widowed throughout their lifetime, but almost everyone will go through the phases of childhood and aging as they reach old age. So, the challenges that sort of are involved as we grow up and as we age means that these two groups, the young and old, are also deserving of our special care and attention. Now, if we look at the Chinese characters for young and old, starting with old, because it's sort of mentioned first, this Chinese character for old is actually made up of three different characters. First, it's based on the character for a person, and that's sort of difficult to see, but it's sort of in the middle here. It is based on the character for a person. There's the element of hair. Obviously, as a person ages, one of the most visible signs is when their hair grays and turns to white. So this is a very visible sign of aging, as well as the character for change, because after all, growing old is a process of change. I think there's two levels. Internally, as a person, the human body ages. Sometimes, very often, its functions will start to deteriorate. For example, our eyesight might not be as good as it used to be. Sense of hearing may not be as it used to be. We might find it more difficult to move around, etc. So on that level, internally, as the human body ages, it will undergo processes of change. And, especially in old age, we feel the effects of those changes ever more keenly. Now, change in terms of the external environment, well, again, as a person ages, they feel the effects of, change in terms of having to adapt or adjust to extreme weather events, or, keeping up with the use of the advancements in the latest newfangled technology. Those sorts of changes becomes more an effort as a person grows older for many number of reasons. Now, that's the character for old. Combination of person, the hair, very visible sign, and the fact that aging, growing old is a process of change. Okay. Now, the character for young, the Chinese character for young is also very interesting. It's made up of two parts. On the left, you have this, it's actually the character for small, and it actually is drawn to resemble a newborn baby, a very rough, basic sketch. You have, maybe a strand of hair, and not much hair on a newborn baby, and really the most largest parts are the hair and sort of the body bit, especially when they're all swaddled up, like in the photo. So that's the character of small, and it's made to resemble a newborn baby. On the right is the character for strength. Now, there are actually two interpretations. The first interpretation, based on this drawing here, on the right, is considered to represent the patterns of human muscle, as sort of illustrated in this the painting on this particular model for an anatomy class. The other interpretation, it's based on an older form of this particular character, and scholars consider that it resembles a plough, so an implement used for working the land on a farm. And to use this, it's a manual tool, obviously requires a great deal of strength. So that's why this character on the right means strength. Now, when you combine the two, you have small and strength. It's denotes someone small in size, as small as a baby, very young in age, and they're obviously of limited strength. So right away from this particular character, it sort of points us to the source of their vulnerability. Young, particularly vulnerable because they lack the strength, they lack their abilities to look after themselves. Okay, that's very interesting. Now, this particular passage in the Exalted Treatise, respect the old and care for the young and old, reminds me of a particular excerpt from a play by Shakespeare. The play is called As You Like It. And what I have on the slide is a particular excerpt, and it's quite well known. It's called All the World's Stage, known by its sort of the first line of this particular excerpt. And it sort of envisages that, the world is a temporary stage where each and every person sort of plays different roles throughout their life. Their lifetime is sort of divided into 7 phases. So you have all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players, actors. They have the exits and the entrances, and one man, one person in their lifetime plays many parts. His acts being 7 ages, it divides a lifetime, the human lifetime, into 7 parts. The earlier parts, at first, the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, so completely helpless, unable to even feed themselves. And then the whining schoolboy with his satchel, the school bag, and shiny morning face, creeping like snail, unwillingly to school. The need for the young children to be educated, to receive some education. And that's at the sort of the start of life, childhood. Now, when we fast forward to the last act, it says last scene of all, that ends a strange eventful history called life, is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. And it's interesting that Shakespeare uses the term second childishness. It's, when we think of the elderly people, some elderly people will come to a stage where they're completely unable to look after themselves, much like a young infant. In mere oblivion, many older people suffer from dementia, so they are unable to remember many things, particularly, recent experiences, what happened yesterday or in the last half hour. Old people tend to lose their teeth. Their eyesight is not as good as it used to be. their taste buds aren't as good as it used to be. And in, at the very end of their life, they lose everything, just as it is when a person is born. They come to this existence with nothing at all, and when they leave, they take nothing at all. So sans everything is the sort of the final end. I'll just stop sharing for a moment. Now, we have a good understanding of, the limitations of these two phases in a person's life when they're at their most vulnerable, in childhood and in old age. So, some people might ask, why do we have to respect the old? Well, in a nutshell, an older person is worthy of our respect because of their accumulated years of learning, of knowledge, of experience, and as a result of all of these things, their seasoned judgment or wisdom. Even if they have never been to school or university, all older people have gone through the university of life. They will have acquired a great deal of knowledge and experience. Yes, that can often differ from the young people of today, but that is, in no sense less worthy. So I suppose this brings us to the next question of what does it really mean to respect the old? Well, I'm sure many of us can think of many ways in which to live out this heart of respectfulness. I have here 3 examples, perhaps, to start us off. The first is, for example, not thinking that we know more and overlooking or ignoring what an older person might have to say. Now, bearing in mind this is all elders, it's not limited to an older person within the family, but older people generally and young people generally within the community. So not thinking that we know more and ignoring their contribution, for example, not interrupting their sentences or walking away when they're talking to us. Another example is not being resentful or condescending when, for example, an older person might take longer to do certain things, when they might need our help in completing certain activities, or ultimately when they can no longer look after themselves. It also means that we have to be patient when they need us to speak slower or repeat ourselves in a louder voice, because their sense of hearing is not as good as it used to be, when we need to read things out to them because their eyesight is not as it used to be. Things like that. And I suppose, most old people really don't want to be a burden on a young person. No one wants to be a burden on anyone. But the reality, unfortunate reality, is that as the human body ages, it will very often deteriorate in many of its functions, whether it's the sensory functions or mobility functions. As I mentioned, our sense of the eyesight, sense of hearing, mobility, walking around. You might have heard of elderly people suffering from falls. And it's actually quite sad because, when it really can really destroy their confidence. It's extremely painful. They can fracture or break bones. And because of that, older people might be more reluctant to get out of their chair. And it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. Their leg muscles deteriorate so that when they do get up and try to walk around, them in more risk of falling over again. So, mobility issues. Older people can feel quite embarrassed when they suffer from incontinence, so loss of bladder control. They might suffer from dementia and become really disoriented and distressed when they find that they can't remember things or people that they feel they should know. So I suppose key to this heart of respect and cultivating this respectfulness is remembering that actually everyone who lives to old age will tend to go through such difficulties as they age. And we have to treat others as we would wish to be treated. As the Chinese saying goes, love and respect the elderly so that we are loved and respected in turn. Now, what happens when a person doesn't respect the old? There's a very interesting account that comes from the late 10th century in what's known as Song Dynasty China, and it relates to a scholar by the name of Yang Danian. He was extremely bright, intelligent. He actually came first in the civil service examinations at the tender age of 20, and he's appointed to work in the palace alongside some very senior and elderly colleagues. There's two in particular, one by the name of Zhou Han and the other by the name of Zhu Ang. And, unfortunately, Yang Danian, he has a bit of an attitude, and he would look down on his elderly colleagues and disparage them for being old. And it got to the point where, his colleagues, Zhou Han, said to him, you shouldn't insult me for being old because you will one day grow old yourself. His colleague, Zhu Ang, would say to him, there's really no need to be discourteous, or else, you could be treated in the same way too. Well, as you would imagine, their words fell on deaf ears. And basically, Yang Danian, by failing to respect the elderly, by failing to heed their advice, he depleted his good fortune, so much so that he actually ended up passing away in his 40s. So he never actually lived to old age. As we read earlier in the treatise, when a person commits misdeeds, their life expectancy can be reduced by units of, 100 days or up to 12 years, depending in units of 12 years, depending on the severity or gravity of their offence. So failing to respect the old is actually a misdeed with consequences. So that is one case of what happens when a person does not respect the elderly people around them. I have a contrasting example. There's another scholar by the name of Wang Bin, and he suffered from poor health. He was ill, ever since he was a young child, basically. He was very thin, get sick so much that he himself believed that there was little chance of him ever living to see old age. But whenever he encountered an elderly person, he would always be very respectful, very admiring. For example, when an elderly person walked past his house, he would, stand up and pay his respects, no matter how humble they were. When he was walking along and happened to meet an elderly person on the footpath, he would always, give way and let them walk ahead of him. So by doing things like that in his day-to-day life, he cultivated this respectfulness to the older people around him. And what happened was that he actually found that he recovered from his poor health. His body got strong and healthier. And he actually ended up living to the age of 93. His account is recorded, just like Yang Danian, in the collected commentaries on the Exalted Treatise under this particular passage, this particular sentence. So, two completely different outcomes derived from contrasting mindsets, two different attitudes towards the elderly people. And I suppose I'd like to share two particular proverbs First one relates, it's about, a person will suffer loss and detriment by ignoring an elder person's advice. This is sort of common Chinese proverb that alerts us to the fact that in every old person, there's a lifetime of learning and experience. And it's really the young person's loss when they fail to take the time to consult and listen to what an older person has to say. We know that old people can often repeat themselves. They love to talk about their, good accomplishments and, the glory days, the fond memories of the past. And young people who tend to be quite impatient will sort of automatically dismiss this. They think they've heard it all before. But I would suggest that the next time you hear an elderly person repeating themselves, and to treat it a bit like, watching a favorite movie or reading a favorite book for the nth time. You find that even though you've read it so many times before, sometimes you notice details that you've missed out in all the previous times, or it makes you realize something that you hadn't thought of ever before. So that's one thing. The other proverb is having an elder in the home is like being enriched with treasure. This is another proverb, and it really draws our attention. Well, obviously, we can benefit from learning from the older person, their experience and wisdom, but it sort of highlights that our time with the elderly people, not just in our family, but in the community, is very much treasured. Everyone has, lives for a finite period of time, and when you get to old age, that time is, you're only available for a limited time. It becomes ever more limited and ever more precious. So it should be treasured. And besides, gaining the benefit and learning from the older person's experience, we can also learn so much in having the chance to learn how to love and care for and respect an elderly person. Obviously, respecting them is a good deed in itself, but there is so much that we can learn and be enriched by. I had the good opportunity, I was fortunate enough to have a lunch with one of my elderly neighbours in the last few days, and she's actually moving back to Malaysia. She's been retired for quite some time, and she's always lived independently. She trained as a nurse from a young age, moved from Malaysia to the UK, trained there as a nurse, and worked around the world in different places. And she's just such a courageous, independent character. She always makes me laugh, and she's now in her 70s. Having lunch with her in the last few days could well be, the last time that I get to see her. So it's really true that, time should be treasured. Now, the final part of the sentence, it won't take too long, because, caring for the young people really is, draws on much of what has already been said in relation to the orphans, the young children without their parents around. But if I could add one last point, from a broader perspective, we want to build a safe, more beautiful place for the young people to live and learn and develop themselves. And I suppose we should try, whatever we say and do, to try and set a positive example for them in developing, cultivating their good ethical character, because that's something that will be useful and beneficial to them in whatever path they choose to pursue. So I think young people represent the world of tomorrow, and that's one way, a very key way of expressing this heart of caring towards the young. Now, before I'd like to conclude on that note, today's passage on taking pity on the orphans, being sympathetic to the widows, respecting the old, and caring for the young. And on behalf of Catherine and myself would love to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. And hope that you have an enjoyable time over the holiday period. And we wish you the best of health and happiness in 2023. We look forward to seeing you next year. So thank you very much for your kind attention. And see you next time. Thank you.